South Korea has secured one of the rotating seats on the United Nations Security Council at a vote in the General Assembly earlier on Tuesday. So what are the implications of this successful bid? What are the tasks undertaken by members of the UN Security Council? And what is the latest regarding calls for reform of this UN entity? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we address South Korea's latest election to the United Nations Security Council as a non-permanent member to serve a two-year term starting January next year. For more on this, I have Professor An Junseong from Yonsei University. Professor An, welcome back.
Okay, thank you.
I also have Kwon Soa with us. Soa, it's good to have you back.
Happy to be here.
Right, Soa, let's begin then with a few words on the results of the latest vote for a non-permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council.
Sure. So South Korea will be one of the 15 members of the UN Security Council, or one of the 10 non-permanent members, starting on January 2024 for a two-year term. And the decision for 5 new members was made at the UN General Assembly at the UN headquarters Tuesday local time, as a vote was carried out at 10 a.m., meaning here in Korea 11 p.m. So the result was announced around midnight here, and South Korea received 180 votes out of 192 UN member states. To get elected, at least 2/3 of votes had to be secured, so more than 128, and the country's goal was also around 180. For South Korea, it was not a competition against another member state for the vacant spot, but it was about either getting support or not by the UN members, as it was the single candidate running for the Asia-Pacific region this time. Similar for Algeria and Sierra Leone, as they were the two candidates for 2 African seats, and Guyana was the only candidate for 1 spot for Latin America. Slovenia and Belarus, however, had to compete for a single seat for Eastern Europe, which Slovenia won by a big margin, 153 to 38. The UNSC is comprised of 5 permanent members, the US, UK, France, China, and Russia, and 10 non-permanent members, with South Korea having been chosen as such non-permanent member for the third time now. The country served as a member from 1996 to 1997 and 2013 to 2014, meaning it has retrieved a seat for the first time in 11 years. But given that South Korea has been just a member of the United Nations since 1991, now serving as the 3rd time as a UNSC member is actually significant, according to experts. Now, the current non-permanent members, meanwhile, are Ecuador, Japan, Malta, Mozambique, Switzerland, Albania, Brazil, Gabon, Ghana, and the United Arab Emirates. And the latter 5 will be replaced by the 5 newly chosen countries, including South Korea, starting in 2024.
Right, 2024. Meanwhile, Professor An, how do you respond to the result of South Korea's latest diplomatic effort to secure a seat on the UN Security Council?
Well, it is actually obviously a clear, achievement, outstanding achievement in the history of Korean, South Korea's UN diplomacy since 1991, and from the perspective that officially South Korea become the 4th Asian country to be elected as a non-permanent member of UN Security Council 3 times or more. So there's Japan 12 times, and still currently serving, right? And then India and Pakistan serve already 3 times. So I guess that officially South Korea became the one of the leading country in Asian Pacific region. I think that's the great challenge, also a great opportunity for the Korea to deal with it in the future. So it means that more responsibility, and it depends on how we do in the future. In 2 years, we'll see what happens. What kind of challenges and opportunity we can find it as a international politics.
Right, once its agenda begins in January 2024. So before we proceed any further, could you tell us a bit about the United Nations Security Council, what it does, and why South Korea has been hoping to be a member of this council in the new term that begins next year?
Right, the UNSC is one of the 5 main bodies at the United Nations, and peace and security, those are the key words that describe what the UNSC is responsible for, or maintaining international peace and security. That means settling disputes by making recommendations or imposing sanctions, and in some cases even authorizing use of force if needed to address threats to global security. To make those decisions, it needs discussions and approvals from members of the Council, and that's the 15 members to which South Korea will belong to starting next year. So what is the significance for South Korea holding a seat at the Council? Remember the two keywords I mentioned that represent the UNSC, peace and security. And when do we in South Korea talk about peace and security? It's mostly linked to North Korea and our goal of achieving permanent peace and security on the Korean Peninsula. Also, when South Korea talks about the UNSC, it's mostly related to North Korea, especially when in Korean media, whenever we talk about the UNSC, mostly we talk about Pyongyang. Whenever North Korea launches a missile or conducts a nuclear test and the UNSC convenes for meetings on those provocative acts, South Korea is part of these talks, even as a non-UNSC member. So having won a seat at the Council will give Seoul a bigger say in dealing with North Korean threats. This is especially significant at this time as Japan is a non-permanent member until next year, because it's one of the 5 members which serves as a member from 2023 to the end of 2024. And the U.S. is a permanent member. And these 3 countries now, the U.S., Japan, and South Korea, have recently bolstered their trilateral cooperation against North Korean threats. Not only that, with South Korea having developed into one of the world's top 10 economies, as well as growing in its military and cultural power, and also having increased its overseas development assistance, or ODA, to developing countries, that's why experts see the significance in the country's membership bigger than during the past 2 times Seoul took a seat at the Council. And South Korea's ambassador to the United Nations, Hwang Jung-guk, told reporters after the country secured its seat that Seoul will do the best in contributing to, quote, world peace, freedom, and prosperity through diplomacy based on universal values, the principles of the UN Charter, and by expanding cooperation with developing countries. And also in a recent interview, he had said that he in particular saw big chances for South Korea to greatly expand its diplomatic horizon as the country in many fields can take the lead or be a leader.
Right, indeed. And Professor An Soa mentioned a potential bigger say by South Korea with regard to North Korea starting next year at the UN Security Council. That being said, what are your thoughts regarding the UN Security Council's responses to North Korea's hostile military activities in recent years?
Well, about the question, it's kind of really just talk about crux of the UN Security Council system. Basically, there's a UN, permanent members, the 5 members have the veto power. So whatever happens, any of the country can cast a veto, and that will not proceed. In North Korea case, as you know, that China and Russia is sometimes behind, coincided with North Korea, their position. So that's happening. That it's very often, history teaches us that it happens. The UN Security Council system, the veto system, make really stopping kind of things progresses. But that's where many people talk about the reform the UN Security Council systems. So also I think I have a different view about the South Korean law as the non-security member from next year, because that some experts talk about issues that might have a bigger control or law say on North Korean issue. But I have a different view, because that even without the non-permanent membership status, South Korea could join it as a party in interest, right? So if we become a member, actually, I think that's from the legal perspective, there's some conflict of interest issue, because we are dealing with our nation country, nation interest that might be a conflict with the international, interest. So there might be, I think that you need to get, that tailor our positions, that really diplomatic way to find a different way to, handle situation, because that we have to take a more objective way, because the International UN Security Council is not a one country's council. It's the comprised also 193 members, right? It's representing all countries, over 100 countries. So we have to put more effort on to persuading the other members, not only the permanent member, also the other, and even the all individual member of the United Nations, tell them why we need to do that, and have to, tell them, sometimes educate them what's going on, and then, to show more our leadership, we need to get more, more professional approach to, and the legal approach to persuade it and making more alliance in the international arena.
Right. Meanwhile, Soa, despite the lack of tangible action with regard to North Korea's recent provocations by the UN Security Council in recent times, in the past, though, the UN Security Council has taken some very concrete steps to punish Pyongyang for its provocations, right?
Right. And Sunny, I in particular remember those times when the UNSC actually and its members were very active in putting their heads together in punishing North Korea for its provocations, which came in the form of missile tests and also nuclear tests, and the consequences back then were sanctions. And I was actually covering North Korea a lot between 2015 and 2016 when I was a foreign affairs correspondent for Arirang. And 2016 was when Pyongyang conducted its 4th and 5th nuclear test. So there's this pattern of steps that came repeatedly. North Korea fires a missile or conducts a nuclear test. The UNSC condemns the action and then convenes an urgent meeting among the 15 members. Then comes a proposal for a resolution or a draft, which is then circulated among the members. Maybe some changes are made here and there in terms of wordings or the list of sanctions. And then a resolution is adopted, meaning sanctions are imposed. So to give you a broad picture of how these concrete measures looked like in the past, now currently trade of weapons and military equipment are banned because this was banned already years ago. Not only that, but a lot of items were added to the ban. For instance, the shipping of minerals, luxury goods, helicopters, etc. There are also sanctions on financial transactions, also freezing of assets of individuals and entities, travel bans for people linked to North Korea's nuclear development. North Korean overseas workers were forced to be sent back to North Korea. And the focus of all of these sanctions was to put restrictions on things that could in some way help the Kim Jong-un regime upgrade its weapons program. But as the North did not show any will to abolish its nuclear program, the sanctions went as far as restricting oil imports, metals, seafood, and agricultural products. So that was the last time in 2017 that such resolution was adopted. And since 2006, the UNSC has adopted around a dozen resolutions related to the North Korean regime's weapons of mass destruction and nuclear activities. And Sunny, as you mentioned, in recent years, there was not really that much of effort done, and that also has a lot to do with the veto power of Russia and China.
Right, and staying with that, because of this perhaps inaction, if I may, by the UN Security Council to deal with North Korea, as well as, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as you mentioned earlier, Professor An, there have been calls for reform, even by the head of the UN. Do you agree with regard to these calls for reform? And if that is the case, what do you propose?
That's a very interesting question, because I used to teach United Nations about the voting system. It's very interesting. The key point about UN Security Council is that the two things, I guess, two issues, is that I guess there's kind of a not consensus yet, perhaps in the current, country in power, maybe they don't want to get a change, but the rest of the country, most of the countries will have agreed that it's time to reform the current system, because that if you see that the UN Security Council system is really based on 1945, post-World War II, the international hegemony system, US, Russia, but things change, now it's 2023, and things change dramatically, and then there's two things that the two main issues about the reform. I guess the first one is about the structure, about the underrepresentation of certain groups. For example, like Asian Pacific region, right? For example, the permanent member, there's only China is one of them. But there's a non-permanent member, there's only one seat out of 10. So that's really underrepresented in terms of population, also the GDP perhaps. And then I think that in that respect, that India is kind of eager to play a great role, right? And the other one is underrepresented by the developing countries, so-called like global south, which also covers India. But in that case, there are so many countries that have a different view about how we update the United Nations system. That's the issue. The other things, more core issues, that how we reform the structure. In terms of voting. like, about the foreign insights. As we know, so the veto system only exclusive, casted by the permanent member. But if you look at the WTO, and WTO developed instituted in 1995, there was so much issue because the most international organization had a so-called consensus rule. So all members have to agree to whatever we do. So we call like a positive consensus. Basically means that, let's say there's 100 countries have to agree on make any decision. That's the traditional consensus rule. But WTO, after getting so much problem and complaint from many countries, they changed their system from positive consensus to negative consensus. What's the difference? In order to means that negative consensus means that if you want to reject any decision made by WTO panel, all countries have to disagree. Means that 100 countries have to disagree to the whatever decision, which is technically impossible because at least one country will agree, whoever winning the situation. So I guess that's things we need to get about the United Security Council. Maybe if you want to keep the veto power, which would limit it to apply to only limited to the permanent member, maybe you might get something balancing, process, such as that, well, you want to keep playing the veto power, maybe you need to limit on your veto powers. Means that perhaps you can do something, just like a presidential veto. So if you presidential veto any bill going back to legislature, and the legislature can reverse it because we have a supermajority, 2/3 of it, something like that. I think that there's many ways you can, reform the UN. But problem was that any country like the U.S., even perhaps UK, France, or China, Russia would not be happy about whatever changing because they really get all the power they have it, right? More than necessary, right? So I guess there's a big issue that other countries, how not only the non-permanent member, the general member of the UN have to get together and reach some kind of consensus level to get, reform, making going, right?
Right, and in the meantime, so as Professor An has mentioned, calls for reform by India have been particularly strong, right?
Right. India, on a number of occasions, has been addressing the need to reform the United Security Council. And most recently, India's ambassador to the UN, Ruchira Kamboj, made such demand at a roundtable on the Unsc reform. Stressing that the time for reform is now, she said the world's pressing challenges call for the need of a council that's more representative, more inclusive, and effective in maintaining global peace and security. The current composition of the council does not reflect, she says, new rising powers and the interconnected and multipolar world we are in today. Through the reform of the council, she called for a more fairer and equitable global order. Kamboj claimed the inclusion of emerging economies with increasing political influence is a pragmatic necessity, and she said that it's time to recognize the contributions made of countries who have demonstrated their ability in fostering peace, promoting development, as well as tackling global challenges. Basically, India is calling on a reshuffle of the membership or expansion of members, be it in the permanent or non-permanent categories. Crises ranging from climate change, terrorism, pandemics, and humanitarian issues could be better tackled, India says, through a wider range of resources, expertise, and perspectives as well. Now, interestingly, the UN ambassador mentioned in this particular speech Africa and Latin America as having potential of playing bigger roles, and not actually asking for India's bigger representation at the council. But also, as Professor An earlier mentioned, India has been very eager in trying to become a member of the, especially the permanent membership of the council. Arguments include India is one of the largest contributors to UN peacekeeping forces. It's the fastest growing economy in the world, and it represents already 1/6 of the world's population.
Right, and India's ambassador to the UN, Professor An, highlighted the inaction of the UN Security Council with regard to Ukraine to support her calls for reform. That being said, do you foresee South Korea, Professor An, taking on a more active role in easing the plight of the people in Ukraine as the UN administration seeks to perhaps take on an expanded role in the international arena?
Well, my answer is yes and no, actually. Yes, because we'll take a greater role because becoming a non-permanent member of the Security Council, you have more choice, make a decision to make. However, in terms of think about here, in a way we see United Nations Security Council means that you're the member of either whether one you're the permanent or non-permanent member, you are representing your region, right, Asian Pacific region, and also you're not really talking for your country alone. You're speaking for the entire member of the UN members, 193. So that should be a different way. You should be a mediator. So, I'm a little bit concerned about the UN administration supporting policies that if you really get closer to a certain country, whichever it is, like U.S., Japan is fine. But problem is that if you want to be the United Nations, really the leadership, global leadership in the United Nations with the multilateral negotiations, right? You need to get mediator, something good mediator to, there are so much issues. For example, as the Soa said, if there's a new opening for the permanent member seat, who's the one going to be there? There's many countries want to go there. For example, India, not only India, think about the developed country. Japan has to be proclaimed they want to be a permanent member next time. Also, think about in Europe, German also, because 1945, that time there were invaders, they couldn't say anything. But now that things changed, they want to take advantage of whatever they have, the economic powers, right? So there are so much issues there. So if we want to be really, if Korea really become a global leader, who play the global leadership in the international area, like a UN, we need to get a good mediator, how to do it, not just, going to whoever side with country. I'm really concerned about the value basis because value is very subjective. Depends on maybe good value to me and the other is bad for you, right? It depends on different color perspective. So I guess my concern is that if you want to be a good, really leader, global leader for the future Korean government, you need to get something mediator, neutral position, something independent, so that any one country will listen to us because we are neutral, independent, makes voice. Also, we try to be good mediator, for the international, conflict. But that is a long way to go because I'm concerned is that the administration is very focused on bolstering trilateral cooperation. Whenever you say that, some country wouldn't like it, not only Russia and China. The other countries have different views, right? So I guess if we want to be a global leader, we should take a more global approach, the more neutral and more, inclusive approach.
Right. In the meantime, so President Yonsei, his poised actually to attend the NATO summit in Lithuania next month. And of course, Ukraine and other global issues, as Professor An has mentioned, will top the agenda back then. Could you tell us a bit about his upcoming agenda?
So Ukraine, just like at last year's NATO summit in Madrid, is expected to be high on the agenda and also raising the question again regarding the country's membership of NATO. Now that, however, according to NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg recently, won't be on the agenda as Ukraine is in the midst of war. And the most urgent task, he said, is to ensure that Ukraine, quote, prevails as a sovereign, independent nation, as only then the membership issue can be discussed. Now, President Yonsei has been invited to the summit in Lithuania, Vilnius, following Stoltenberg's visit to South Korea back in January. And during that one-on-one, President Yoon had promised to continue to cooperate with the international community in helping the Ukrainian people. Possibly there's also going to be a visit with Ukraine, a meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky before or after the NATO meeting. That actually coming from Japanese media. And also a trilateral Seoul, Washington, Tokyo summit is possible because at the G7 in Hiroshima, there was not an official summit. President Yoon is also expected to brief leaders on North Korea's increasing nuclear and missile threats, including the recent launch of a spy satellite.
Right, and expected another launch before June 11th, that would be. All right, so as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Professor An, thank you very much for your insights.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Right, well, that ends this edition of Issues and Insiders. We return same time tomorrow, that is Thursday, so do join us then.